I want to do a few quick updates on things that I think are important and that some of you have asked me about before we turn to the topic for tonight, which is socialism and what is happening, why is it coming back, and what does all that mean. The first thing, because it's so hot literally today, are some comments about this quote-unquote trade war between the United States and China. Over the weekend, we were supposedly had been told by our president, among other things, that things were working out and we were heading towards an agreement. And then on Sunday, he did 100 tweets or whatever it is he did, and said, "Oh no, it's terrible. They've gone back on their word," or whatever words he used. And then the stock market the last couple of days tanked as everybody's getting nervous. And he threatened to raise tariffs a great deal more on Friday of this week, so in 2 days. The Chinese then this morning officially announced that if he did that, they would retaliate with tariffs, which is what they did already the first couple of times that this was done. And so now we are facing the risk of some sort of ongoing conflict between the United States and China. It is still the best bet, as best I can tell, and most who look at it, that all of this is about 80 to 90% political theater, undertaken by Mr. Trump, because he's the one who's initiated all of this. The Chinese reluctantly do the tit for tat, but all the initiative, you should all be aware that all the initiative here is coming from the United States, Mr. Trump, the Republicans, and the Democrats, who are extraordinarily quiet about all of this. If they're opposed, there's hardly a word about it. So the Chinese are assuming, as is the rest of the world, that this is American policy, not just Mr. Trump. He might be doing it in a way that's the naughty boy, but that's his signature. That's how he does everything. He's going to do it that way here, too. So a few comments just to make sure you're all on the same page. First, Mr. Trump repeatedly says something about the tariffs, which is not only incorrect and wrong, but would get him to be flunked in any freshman course in economics. No, seriously. Even by the most right-wing professor wanting to help him would give him at least a C- at best. Here's what the mistake is. He keeps saying, he said it again this weekend, that the tariffs are a great thing because it's costing China billions of dollars to pay these tariffs that we're imposing on them. That's wrong. That's not a perspective. That's not a point of view. That's wrong. W-R-O-N-G, you flunk, wrong. Why? A tariff is just a tax. All that the word tariff means is a particular kind of tax. And it's a tax that you put on something when it comes into your country, crossing your border. So a tariff is like if you buy a European car made in Europe and it is shipped here, a tariff means when it arrives here, let's say it costs $20,000, this car from someplace. Now, the government of the United States requires the importer, the American company that imports, to pay a tax on that $20,000 car from Europe. It doesn't affect how much money the $20,000 car gets for the European who produced it. He produced it, he gets his $20,000 because that's his price. But we Americans have to pay the $20,000, the price of the car, plus the tax that our government puts on it. So the Chinese don't pay the tariffs, you do. And of course, it's not good for the president to say, I slapped them with a big tariff that costs you, because that doesn't come out right. So he says what he would like to be able to say. You know, like you'd like to be able to, at the end of this evening, go out, get in your Mercedes, and go home. But you don't have a Mercedes. And even if you tell yourself all night about how fun it'll be to get into your Mercedes, you kind of know when you're done tonight, no Mercedes. Mr. Trump doesn't live in a restricted world like that. So he thinks by saying it, all of us, all of you, all of the Americans will go, oh boy, he stuck it to the Chinese. He didn't. That's not what a tariff is or how it works. Okay? Number one. He repeats this crapola, and a large part of the media simply, a few do, but most of them don't register the utter absurdity of all of this. All right, number one. Number two, there are 8 million ways to get around a tariff. For example, the idea of the tariff is if you follow my example, it raises the price of that car. The car used to come in, $20,000 is what it cost. You paid $20,000. If you put a tariff on it, now it costs, let's say if it's a 10% tariff, it costs $22,000. The 20 it costs plus a $2,000 tariff. It costs Americans $22,000. Why is this interesting for an American company? Because there's an American company that makes a car just like it, for which it has to charge, ready? $21,000, because it's the only way you can make any profit off of it. But the problem is now, for a while, they can only make profit if they charge $21,000, making it here in America, and they're having a problem because you and I are not going to buy that car for $21,000 if we can get the equivalent from Europe for $20,000. So the American company goes to Washington, goes to Mr. Trump and says, hey, now watch what they say. Here's what they don't say. We stink at what we do. We can't produce a car for $20,000, not with love or the help of Almighty God. We can't. And so we are in trouble because everybody's buying the imported car for $20,000. Now, Mr. Trump, the only reason they can do it for $20,000 is, get ready, they're cheating. They're cheating. They don't really know how to make a good car for $20,000 that costs us $21,000. They're cheating. And that's not fair. So help us defeat these cheaters by slapping on a tariff. What company is going to go to Washington and say, help us make a profit even though we are less productive than the other guy, the imported guy? None of them are going to say that because you're not going to get very far with that. Help me, I'm unproductive. Doesn't sound good. Help me, I'm the victim of foreigners cheating. That sounds much better. And it's much better for the politician to be able to say, I gave a tariff because the other side is cheating. How do I know this? Because tariffs have been used as policy for at least the last 400 years. We have lots of experience. And here's what we learned if we spend any time at it. Every capitalist crook, and that's a large percentage, has at one time or another gone to a politician to get a tax that helps him. They've learned years ago how to do that, how to bribe and, donate to the politician, to get an ear, to tell a story. And then they pay the advertisers to say, we don't want help because we're inefficient and can't compete. No, we want help because the other side is cheating. If you believe that on the say-so of the companies that are getting the tariff, you need help. You're being played with. And you shouldn't make it easy for people that play with you in that way, especially when in the end, it's your money that is being removed from your wallet to pay for all of this. The notion, repeated every day, the Chinese have gone back on what they do. The Chinese are subsidizing their enterprises. Cheating, in other words. Second point, everybody cheats. Everybody cheats. Let me give you some examples. When the state of Arkansas decided to build certain roads to certain factories that were being constructed so that they would have an easier time, trucks getting into the factory with the inputs and trucks coming out with the export. That made it possible for that company to lower the price because they didn't have the difficulties of transportation they used to have. That's a subsidy. They could then lower the price of whatever it is they were making because in effect the government had just subsidized them by building a very new convenient road. The Chinese do, of course, the same thing. That's part of how countries compete with one another. Every capitalist in every country is constantly trying to get those kinds of benefits. Do you understand? There's a special program to allow, let's pick something where we can play the game. We want to help, here we go, ready? Retarded people. So the government is going to help retarded persons by getting them a job. You know how that's done? We're going to give the company that hires these persons a help. If the wage to be paid to them is $15 an hour, the government will pay $7.50. So the employer only has to pay $7.50. This is a piece of help to a community that needs it. Everybody feels good. That's a subsidy. That company can now lower the price of what it sells because its labor costs were just reduced through a governmental help. Last December, the government of Mr. Trump gave every business in America an enormous tax cut. That's called a subsidy. That makes it possible for them to lower the price and still be profitable because their taxes had just been cut. By the way, from 35 to 21%. That's a 40% tax cut. The Chinese could have, they didn't, but they could have gone into court, the World Trade Organization, and said, look, they're subsidizing. We didn't give our businesses a tax cut like that. It's true, they didn't. It's true the United States subsidized. But the Chinese didn't do it because everybody does that all the time. We would be in court all day long. Everywhere in the world if we were trying to monitor that. All that these trade agreements do is limit, kind of say, look, do it, but don't do it too much. If you do it too much, we're going to make a stink about it, and it'll look bad for you, and then we'll go back to the normal amount of this, which is happening all the time. So then what is this all about? What this is about is a serious issue. And the serious issue is the United States, for the last 40 years, indulged the Chinese on exactly what is now no longer acceptable. You ought to ask yourself, why now? Are the Chinese doing something in the last 2, 3, 4 years that they didn't do in the last 30? No. They're doing exactly the same. And that was a basic deal. And it was as follows. We, the Chinese, and I'm going to come back to this later, we have a strategy for how to go from being a poor country to a rich one, which is what most of the world is busy interested in doing, like their number one priority. Okay, how are we going to do it? And they made a strategic decision. We are going to become the manufacturer of everything. We're going to succeed by doing what? We're going to produce everything the world now consumes, either better quality or more cheaply or both. That's what, by the way, in setting out this strategy, they were like many countries who thought that would be a good plan. The difference is they did it. They succeeded brilliantly and in record time, 30 years, which for this kind of a project is very little. 40 years, 30 years, depending on how you count. Here's the deal they made to do this. They knew they could not do that without a lot more capital than they could generate in their own country. Number two, they knew they were far behind technologically what they needed to get to be able to do this plan. And number three, they could produce more effectively and they could produce more cheaply, but if they didn't have some way to get that distributed around the world, all of their success in manufacturing would go nowhere because they couldn't distribute. So they needed distribution help, capital, and technology. So they did the logical thing. They went to the West, to the developed capitalist world, United States, Western Europe, and Japan, above all. And they said, we offer you a deal. Here's what we need: a distribution system, technology, and capital. If you give us those things, here's what we'll give you. We'll give you a disciplined, hard-working labor force at a ridiculously low wage. Number one. Number two, we will give you the freedom to sell what you can produce with this low wage in China here in China. And we're the fastest growing market in the world. So we're going to give you cheap labor and a fantastic growth area for you. That's what you get. What we get is technology, capital, and a distribution system. Are you with me? So companies who didn't have to, nobody's holding a gun to their heads, American companies and British companies and Japanese companies jumped at the chance. Yes, they said, here's the capital, here's the technology, give us the laborers, give us the support infrastructure, and give us the access to your markets, which the Chinese did. Gave them all that. The deal was made. Tremendous profit for the companies that went to China and did this. They got out of it what they hoped for. And the Chinese got out of it what they hoped for. It was a successful capitalist deal. Distribution was, of course, arranged, as is only proper, by the Walmart Corporation, which became the #1 partner for the People's Republic of China. Why? Because Walton said, the Walmart, we will distribute whatever you make into every corner of the United States, out-competing whatever other company, American, used to have its stuff on the Walmart shelf. Out in comes the Chinese stuff, often produced by the same American company that closed its facilities in the United States and opened them in China because they could pay workers so much less. You understand? China didn't steal the technology. China made a deal for the technology. To call it stealing now is like, I make a deal. I give you this, you give me that. As soon as we're done, I tell the world that you took what I just paid you to get that. There's a nice game, but it requires stupid people to take it seriously. And none of you wants to think you could possibly be that. So it worked. But it worked way better than American policymakers thought it would, because the Chinese were very careful. They gave the foreign companies a chance, but they held on. They learned the technology. When they could do it themselves. They didn't need the American company. The American companies weren't stupid. They knew what they were getting into. Nobody played any games because there are none to be played here. The problem is the Chinese did it much better and much faster than anyone expected. So now suddenly, here they are, the fast-growing economic system that is now #2 after the United States. Now, final point about that #2, which I did with you a month ago, but I can see from the number of people who still have a hard time with this. 2 basic statistics. 1, over the last 25, 30 years, the average growth of output every year, that's the GDP, percentage growth of GDP, that's what economists use to kind of measure how well an economy is going. The average growth rate in China over the last 25 years, 10 to 11% a year. The average growth rate in the United States over that period, 3. Do you understand? That's one line going like this, and the other line going like this, and as this one comes up and this one's going this way, they're gonna cross. The United States is being caught up by the Chinese. They're not even, this year, which is the slowest year in many in China, the economy is growing, 2018, the last year, 6.4%. United States, 2.9%, depending on how you count, maybe 3. So in a bad year, China is growing more than twice as fast. Now the one that's even more important, real wages. What are real wages? That's the money wage an average worker gets, adjusted for the price he or she has to pay. So it's a measure of how much you can really afford to get in the way of goods and services for whatever you get paid. The average real wage in the United States today is roughly what it was in the middle of the 1970s. We have not had an increase in real wages for 40 to 50 years. That the working class of the United States has accepted this is the single most important political problem of this country, and it has been for a long time. It's a challenge to you and me to figure out how the power in this society was able to get that to be accepted by all of us. Well, we know some of the ways it was done, which is, you give it away with your faces right now. You didn't know. Okay, that's a good way. The second way was to allow American workers to keep consuming more, even though their wages weren't going anywhere, which is called debt. Your mortgage, your car, your credit card, your college education. You are up to here in debt. Here's the beauty of it. By not raising your wages for 40 years, while you became more and more productive, profits went crazy. Because you remember, if your productivity goes up per worker, it means what you give to the employer for every hour you work goes up. Your real wage is what he gives you, which went nowhere. If you're giving more and more to the employer, and he's giving you the same, that's going to make him richer, and you not at all. Which is why the inequality in our country gets nuts. There's no mystery here. The only mystery is why the working class accepted it. Here's the best part. When the American working class gave up on getting wages and took debt instead, who the hell you think lent them the money? The employers, because they had all the profits, since you didn't require higher wages and you kept making more and more for them. They took the money that they didn't pay you in wages and lent it to you. You idiot. It really is. It's as if at the end of the week I said, I'm sorry, I'm not giving you a wage like I used to. Here's a loan for the same amount. Better, I'll give you a little extra. You used to get 100, I'll give you 120. It's a loan, you see. So you're going to have to pay it back to me, and you're going to have to pay me interest. Other than that, it's sort of like a wage, only it isn't. And if you say thank you and go home, then it's going to happen next week too, and the week thereafter. But it's been going on for 40 years.
The boss has said if you want a raise, I'm going to close the factory and go to China.
Absolutely, and enough of them did it to make it a credible threat. Last thing, though, the statistic. So the real wage in America is flat. Millions of families over these last 40 years, you know how they made do? It wasn't just with borrowing. It was also sending the women out to work in families that didn't do that before, which is not so much the people of color. It's more the white people whose women stayed home, by and large. But those women had to go in. In order for the family to function when the wages went nowhere for 40 years, women had to learn how to no more stay at home, go to work just like the husband, come home just as tired, and for roughly 50%, get divorced. Because that's a very hard adjustment. Seriously, that's a very hard adjustment. This is not a comment on whether it's good or bad. It's a very hard adjustment and was forced on the American working class because they bought this absurd deal. Over the last 25 years, really hold on to this number, over the last 25 years that the real wage in America was flat. What happened to the real wage, the average wage of a Chinese worker? Ready? Real wage, not the money adjusted for prices. It quadrupled. It went up by 400%. Do you understand? The Chinese government is a hero in China, just as it would be here if the last 40 years had to deliver to you a quadrupling of the average real wage. There's no contest here. Do you understand? That's why this theater has to be performed. Because it's too blunt, it's too gross, the difference. By the way, it's a poorer country than we are, so they grew fast, but they grew from a low base. So you can still say, gee, the Chinese are poorer than we are. Absolutely. But wow, is that accordion going like this? The difference is shrinking. This year, the average wage in China will be roughly equal to that in Portugal and Greece. They're catching up fast. They're not that picture from the National Geographic of 20 years ago. None of that's over, and that's not coming back. Nor is the dominance of the United States. And part of what you're seeing in this whole theater is the desperate recognition of the United States that it may now be what they can do. Too little and too late. They waited too long. But the danger, and I mean this really seriously, this will not be the first time that a country seeing its dominance threatened this way resorts in the end to war. War with China, war with Iran as a side way to get into and disrupt the Silk Road projects that you know about and the Chinese are undertaking. Very serious stuff. And since you have a literally loose cannon in the White House, World War I was started not in a fight between the British and the Germans, who were the main adversaries, or the United States or Britain or Russia, by an obscure aristocrat in a place called Serbia that no one knew or cared about. Somebody, he was riding down the road in a coach and someone killed him, and the next thing we knew, we had World War I. So it can start anywhere. Pick a place. I don't know, Venezuela. I don't know, Israel, Palestine. I don't know, fill in the blank. The opportunities are everywhere. Okay, quick 2 or 3 others. Number 1, on May 1st, the House of Commons in England declared a national climate change emergency. It is not, there's a conservative government dominates the House of Commons. The Labour Party is the minority party. So the Conservatives, the Labour supported it, but the Conservatives and Labour together, climate change is a threat to the entire survival of Great Britain, and we must now do, it's not clear what the results of this will, but it's an extraordinary verbal commitment of the government, the entire government, to deal with this as a national emergency. At the same time that this is happening in Britain, in the United States, the government acts like there is nothing there. None of this is an issue. None of this need to concern anybody. I just want you to deal with these levels of dichotomy. In its way, that is as gross a difference between this country and another part of the world as is the difference between real wages in America and real wages in the People's Republic of China. I don't always want to be seen as telling stories in which the working class wins. If some of my fellow leftists feel the need to only talk about when labor wins, which always then leaves the question, if we're always winning, why are we in such bad shape? So I feel it requires sometimes to talk about when we don't. And it's really sad for me, I don't know about any of you, but in the United States, we have a very sad situation with classical music. Most of our cities and towns have no classical music. Any of you who've ever traveled through Italy, you'll know that every town has an opera. It's part of the culture there. It's just a different situation. But we don't in the United States. We require that if you want to have a symphony orchestra and play that kind of music in your community, you have to rely on very rich people to endow a foundation. You know, like the New York Philharmonic, and they will then build a palace of celebration of their wealth, you know, like Lincoln Center, that has Charles Koch, or Koch, or however you pronounce his name. Help me, how do you pronounce his name? Koch. I can see you have to be careful with that, sorry. Koch, of course, yes. Anyway, so that's how we do it. If you know, either you don't have any symphony, which is screw you, or you have one that is brought to you by wealthy people. Wealthy people, that's a euphemism, corporate people, and they have, based on what they do with their businesses, an attitude towards labor like, get rid of it. Why have it? They're all greedy, they don't work hard, they want to spend their life in the bathroom, they're drunk, or whatever, you know. So this creates a disconnect because the workers in a symphony, you know, are the violinists and the tuba players and the drummers and the trumpeters and the clarinetists and all the others. They are musicians who probably love their instrument. They've spent a lifetime becoming great at it and so forth. So it was sad to see a strike this spring by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, one of the greatest orchestras, for those of you that know something about classical music, it's one of the great orchestras of the world, and one of the 4 or 5 best here in the United States, and has been for decades, a long time. The entire orchestra went on strike. The conductor, Riccardo Muti, a very important conductor in the world, also supported the strike, and most of the people who go to the symphony supported the strike. But the chair of the Chicago Symphony Board turns out to be the wife, a woman named Helen Zell, who is the wife of a man named Sam Zell. Sam Zell is a real estate tycoon, you know, like Trump. And he has lots of buildings, and he's worth a ton of money. Well, I was about to say like Trump, but given this morning's New York Times, not Trump, not Trump. Mr. Zell has actually made money and paid taxes, whereas Mr. Trump hasn't done either of those things. Okay. And they were tough. They let them walk. They let them miss a whole bunch of concerts. But the musicians held firm. They stayed out on strike. They went out on strike. During the time of the strike, the graduate students at the University of Illinois in Chicago also had a strike, and the musicians joined the picket line of the students and vice versa. There was some nice labor solidarity. But then in came to resolve this problem the mayor of Chicago, a man named Rahm Emanuel. And he immediately fixed it all, so the workers were defeated. The symphony won. The workers lost their defined pension benefit. That was the single most important issue. What's the issue? That there would be a reasonable pension at the end of the 30 years that an average musician gave to playing in the orchestra for the people, that he or she would not be in trouble when they retired. This clearly, for these billionaires, was an outrageous benefit that they had been enjoying for the last 30 years, and so with real resolve, they got rid of that. That strike was defeated. And that led me to do some research, whereupon I discovered that in 2016, the Pittsburgh Symphony went on strike, and after many weeks, it was required to go back to work with significant concessions, which included a 7% pay cut in the first year and the loss of their defined pension plan. In 2013, the San Francisco Symphony went on strike. They were able to get a 4.5% pay raise, but they had at the same time to pay a significantly larger portion of their health insurance, which left them effectively no better off. And in the end, in Minneapolis in 2012, likewise, the lockout there lasted for 488 days. There's only 365 in a year, so they were out for more than a year. The loss of an entire season, the quitting of their music director, the quitting of a number of their players. When they finally went back to work, they accepted a contract that meant they would not reach the level of pay they had gotten in 2012 again until 2020. In other words, their salary was frozen until next year at the level it had been as of 2012. Then it's a small number of people, they're musicians, they play in symphony orchestras. They just got really screwed. And they got screwed by a combination of corporations and the politicians the corporations put in office. Should be real clear who's doing the work. By the way, the first one I told you about, Chicago Symphony, has an endowment, that's wealth that they own, of $300 million plus a $60 million investment fund. The notion that they could not afford to pay the 70 or whatever musicians it was a decent pension, I mean, I leave to your notion of what is or isn't reasonable.